Hey, as we move along this afternoon, our next speaker is Gwen Holdmann. Gwen is the director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Previously, as the vice president of new development in the Chena Hot Springs Resort near Fairbanks, and I've been there myself more than once, she oversaw the construction of the first geothermal power plant in Alaska, and in addition to numerous other innovative energy projects. Gwen is an Arctic Fulbright Scholar and winner of several awards, including the R&D 100 Award and the Alaska Top 40 Under 40 Award. And Gwen grew up in the lower 48, but she has lived in Alaska ever since 1994. I welcome to the podium Gwen Holdmann.
Thank you. This is the North American electric grid. It extends north into Canada and south into Mexico. The grid represents how we produce, distribute, and manage the electric power that every single one of us relies on to manage virtually every aspect of our modern way of life. It's been called by some the largest and most complex machine ever built by mankind. And we don't have to think about it very much. It just works. It's there to serve us. When we flip on the light in our home or have the lights here in the auditorium, we don't think about the fact that that power was produced less than 1 second ago at a power generating station maybe hundreds of miles away from here. Or the fact that at every moment all across this grid, the power produced and the power consumed has to exactly match each other at every moment in time all the way across this entire grid. It just happens. It's kind of like magic, and we don't have to think about it too much. But what would happen if you lived beyond the edge of this grid, if you didn't have that grid available to you, if you couldn't rely on it? What if you lived in Nuuk or Tuntatuliak or Tuktoyaktuk, somewhere up in this gray area that we've also been calling the Arctic? What if you don't have access to that grid? I found this out the hard way. When I moved to Alaska as a young adult, I had two goals. I wanted to be a space physicist, and I wanted to be a dog musher. So I accomplished one of those goals, and it was the second one. This is a picture of me racing in the Iditarod Sled Dog Race, which is a 1,000-mile race across the state of Alaska. And my husband and I, thank you, we still have a sled dog team that we run, and actually he runs the Iditarod every year. But when I first moved to Alaska, I had these dogs, and even in Fairbanks, they don't let you keep a bunch of sled dogs in downtown. I don't know why that is. Something about the barking dogs and things like that. So much to the horror of my parents, because this is pre-cell phone and all that kind of stuff, I moved into this abandoned trapper's cabin, which was great because it was off the road system. There were no neighbors, and I had access to hundreds of miles of trails. It was just perfect, right? What more could you ask for? The only thing is that from a technological perspective, it was like stepping back in time a century or more, right? If I wanted water for myself and the dogs, I had to go down to the creek and haul it up there. I cut wood for heating. I used an oil lamp for light, and I had a root cellar to keep stuff cold in the summer and keep it from freezing in the winter. So here's our home today. And if you came and visited our home on the outskirts of Fairbanks, you'd come in, and by most measures, you would think of it as being a pretty modern American home. You turn on the lights, and the power comes on. You turn on the faucet, we have running water. We have flush toilets and high-speed internet. But this home is still located beyond the edge of that grid front. So to have those services, we need to provide those ourselves. And we do that through a combination of a wind turbine. We have solar panels here. We have a diesel generator that's located in a below-ground tank to keep it warm when we're not using it. And then we have a battery system and sort of a control management system in the basement of our home. And that's how we run our electric grid, which we call a microgrid or a mini grid or whatever sort of mini islanded grid version you want to call it. Here's my kids. They've never known any other way of life, right? So for them, energy conservation, energy efficiency measures are just a natural thing to do. They help us haul wood to heat our home. They're very cognizant of the fact that if we use too much electric power at light, the batteries might drain, and in the morning the lights aren't going to work. Here they are, they're actually turning our solar panel. We don't have an automated tracker. Whenever somebody walks by the panels, you just kind of reorient them to capture the maximum amount of sunlight that you can get, and so that's sort of our tracking system. So in the hundreds of remote communities across the Arctic, this is basically exactly how electric power services are delivered. Instead of having a diesel generator, a small one buried in a tank below ground, they might have a powerhouse like this one. This is in a community called Shungnak. So the diesel generators that power the little local community are in this building here. This is a community of 308 residents in northwest Alaska. And you can see that tank right behind the building. That's what contains all of the fuel. I'm gonna put this down maybe. Maybe it won't advance that on me. Okay, that's what contains the fuel that they use for the entire year. It's delivered there one time a year by barge. All the fuel is put in that tank, and that's what they use to generate electric power. And this creates a couple of different challenges. First of all, people are surprised to find that the fuel that we're using in these remote places in Alaska is actually not Alaska fuel. We're an oil producing and exporting state, but the fuel that's being used in these remote communities is being transported from outside the state along our coasts and into the river systems. And this happens at fairly high cost. So you have a place like Shungnak, it's between Kotzebue and Kobuk, and I actually just checked. See, I swear I'm not touching it. We had this exact same problem yesterday. But the cost for a gallon of diesel heating oil, the retail rate in Shungnak right now is $9.18 a gallon, okay? Now that sounds like a lot, but that's actually magnified when you also learn that the average per capita income in Shungnak is $10,000 a person. So if you think about that, all the cash income you have would get you $1,000 of fuel. That's it, right? All of a sudden, it creates really different incentives for things like installing renewable energy. There are very few gas stations in remote places in Alaska, so this is the only one I found to take a picture of. This is in Bethel, which is one of our bigger communities. And on the day I took this picture, I actually checked, and the national average for a gallon, the national average price for a gallon of unleaded gasoline was $2.23. So even in some of our larger communities, the costs can be very expensive. On top of this, these long distribution lines for a very limited summer window to get this fuel into these remote places can cause significant challenges. There's places, for example, where the barge might not be able to make it all the way up the river system because the water level's too low. And at that point, you have to fly the fuel in. And that's going to add another couple dollars easily to the cost of fuel in that community. Here's an example from Nome, Alaska, that some of you probably saw in the headlines from 2012, even down here, where the last shipment of heating oil didn't make it into the community of Nome due to fall storms. See, I'm really not touching it. And so ultimately, that fuel was delivered using a Russian ice-hardened tanker, the Renda, accompanied by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the Healy, to get that shipment in. And so you can imagine that the price of fuel in Nome for heating oil was quite a lot higher that year and until that fuel was used up. So, like I mentioned, that does create a lot of incentive for integrating renewable resources to displace this imported diesel fuel, and this is an example of the wind farm in Nome. Now, after sort of personally living this challenge in terms of managing energy systems in these remote areas, I decided to change my career focus away from space physics and get into energy engineering. And so early in my career, I was hired by a local hot springs resort, the owners Bernie and Connie Carl, and I had only one mandate. My goal was to make this site, which was also beyond the edge of that grid front, so it relied on diesel power to generate power. The goal was to make this site as independent as possible from the perspective of both energy and food. And so as a young engineer, this was a pretty cool challenge that I got got to try to meet. And so the food portion actually wasn't that challenging. They already were using the geothermal water to heat most of the buildings on site, and so we extended that to build a greenhouse. It was the first year-round greenhouse in interior Alaska. And so even at minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit, we were able to grow produce in the greenhouse there for the resort and for the restaurant there. We also did a lot of other kind of innovative projects around that hot water resource and the other resources available there. We developed a refrigeration system to keep a local 10,000 square foot ice museum cold, so we used hot water to make ice. And we also did things like generate hydrogen and mix that with propane and use that as a cooking fuel, and then used waste vegetable oil from the kitchen there to use as a fuel and run vehicles as well off of that. But the biggest challenge was actually around power generation. The water temperatures at this site aren't particularly hot for a geothermal resource. They're 165 degrees Fahrenheit. If you go and get a really good hot latte at Starbucks, it's about that temperature. So it's not super high temperatures. And in general, the consensus was, or the body of literature stated that you can't really generate power at those kinds of temperatures, at that level of a geothermal resource. But I sort of suspected that we actually might have a secret weapon in the Arctic at our disposal related to this. When you want to become an engineer and you start to take classes, one of your first classes you take is thermodynamics. And what you learn in thermodynamics is that the amount of work you can perform, or the amount of power you can generate, isn't just a function of how much heat you have, but it's also a function of what the ambient temperature is, like what the cold side of that is, and the difference between those two tells you how much power you can generate. And so in Alaska, we might not have had a super high temperature on the geothermal side, but we had some really good cold resources at our disposal. We had cold air, cold water, and so it turns out that premise was true, and we were able to generate meaningful amounts of power at 165 degrees Fahrenheit. It's the lowest temperature operating geothermal power plant in the world, and so that was a pretty big deal. We reverse engineered a refrigeration system. It got a lot of national and international recognition. We cut the ribbon on it. This is great. And then the next thing I wanted to do is I wanted to go over here and turn off the diesel generator, right? I mean, that's the whole goal. But it turns out this actually wasn't as easy as you would think, because actually equipment like this isn't designed to produce the grid. There is no grid, right? The grid is being produced by the diesel generator over here. That is the grid. It's providing voltage and frequency that we expect from the light socket, from the socket. So we struggled with this a little bit because this was designed to follow a grid. The equipment wouldn't work if there wasn't a grid already in place, as would be common in the lower 48. Well, it turns out that to find those solutions actually needed to look a lot closer to home, because Alaskans have been working on these things for quite a while. This is a community of St. Paul. It's remote even by Alaskan standards. It's in the Pribilof Islands. It's a community of about 500 residents. And the Native Corporation there has been pioneering a strategy for 15 years now. They've been operating this system at their local airport facility to run off 100% wind power when there's an adequate resource available, when the wind is blowing, with no battery system. And they're doing that using a synchronous condenser, an old technology, nothing fancy, nothing new, nothing modern, but they're doing that, and they've been doing it, and they've been doing it for 15 years. The really interesting thing about this is a picture from Teller, Alaska. The average per capita income here, by the way, is about $8,000 a resident. The interesting thing is that there's a real paradox in these rural communities that I've really come to find. In one way, they resemble the developing world much more than they resemble anything else in the United States. Now, there's very minimal infrastructure in these communities. Even having access to modern water and wastewater systems is a luxury in most of these places. They don't have access to that here in Teller, for example. The economy is very much still subsistence-based. It relies on hunting and fishing, those kinds of activities, living off the land. But at the same time, the Arctic has always been a place really ripe with innovation and creativity in how people are managing to live and survive and even thrive in this really difficult environment. In the Arctic, we saw the very first sunglasses. The Arctic brought us kayaks and snowshoes, things that are ubiquitous in modern way of life, but these things were invented in the Arctic by people that needed those as tools to survive in this landscape. And taking advantage of the natural world around them is part of their DNA, right? And so incorporating their natural resources to generate energy to support their community is a natural evolution of that. Here's 4 communities down in southwest Alaska. They're working together. They're all independent. They all have their own power grid, but they're working together as part of the Chinook Wind Group. And they're working with an Alaskan company called Intelligent Energy Solutions and an innovator, his name is Dennis Miners, that's really ahead of his time in many ways. And these communities are also seeking strategies to turn off their diesel generator and run 100% off wind power. And they're doing that through a combination of maybe using advanced storage solutions like a lithium-ion battery system, or storing energy in a different form, in a form of heat in people's homes when they have adequate wind resource instead of as electric power. Kodiak Island is taking this all one step further. They're actually 100% operating off of renewable energy on a year-round basis. They've actually turned off the diesel generator essentially for good. And they're doing this with a combination of hydropower and 9 megawatts of wind power. They have a small battery system to help balance the wind power. And most recently, they've installed some flywheels, some small flywheels, to manage big inrush currents for electric cranes in their harbor. That was a big load that they had a hard time managing on their small grid. And so what they're doing is really pushing the envelope in terms of integrating renewables, where they're no longer reliant on fossil energy resources. They're doing this mix of different strategies. Alaska, about half of the communities in Alaska are now incorporating grid scale levels of renewables with their diesel-based power generation. This represents 12% of the world's microgrids that have renewable resources incorporated on their grids. 12% in the whole world, and this is for a state that has a population of 750,000 people. That's pretty significant. We have millions of hours operating these systems in islanded mode. And that's a pretty big market advantage in many ways. There are things that other places in the country can learn from these experiences. This is not from remote Alaska. This is not something that you would find in remote Alaska because it's part of the grid. The grid as we know it here in the lower 48. This is a high voltage substation. You probably have passed them many times on a highway or driving around your community and not given them a second thought, but they're actually a really important node on this giant electric transmission system that we have across the country. This is where you take high voltage power that's transmitted from far away from a generating station, and you step it down to voltages that we use in our distribution to bring power to our homes and to our businesses. There's thousands of these in the country, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission recently conducted a power flow analysis that indicated that some of these nodes, some of these intersections on this big electrical highway across the country are very important, critical kind of nodes. And there's about 30 of these really critical nodes all across the country. And if 9 of these were knocked out simultaneously during a time of high power usage, we could have a coast-to-coast blackout. And so you can imagine that this would be a pretty significant challenge. It's an unlikely event, but nonetheless, in different regions and different communities, we do experience power outages, as we saw after Hurricane Sandy. And not as a surprise, New York is now taking a leading role in terms of reinventing the way that they deliver electric power. They're looking at microgrids, they're looking at distributed generation, integrating renewables and energy storage solutions, just like we've been doing in Alaska now for over a decade. So I'd like to leave you with, when you think of Alaska, don't just think of this cold, dark place with melting glaciers and big mountains and vast tundra, but think of people that are innovators, that are surviving and thriving in this harsh landscape, and that also have something to offer to each of you, and think about that in the future when you flip on that light switch, or maybe you flip on the switch and the power is out. Think about the fact that in the future, you might actually be using strategies for your community or for your utility that were pioneered in Alaska, and the people there that embody the North to the Future logo of the state of Alaska. So thank you.